The Ural Mountains extend across western Russia in a long chain of forests, valleys, and exposed ridges. For centuries they have stood as a natural boundary between Europe and Asia. Much of the range is remote. In winter, large sections become isolated from roads and settlements. Human activity becomes infrequent, and distance begins to take on a different scale. The northern Urals are not defined by steep alpine peaks. Their elevations are moderate compared to many mountain systems. Their difficulty comes from exposure. Trees gradually disappear with altitude, giving way to open slopes where snow moves freely under strong winds. The terrain becomes broad and featureless. During storms, horizons can disappear completely. In late January and early February of 1959, the region was deep in winter. Temperatures frequently dropped well below freezing. Winds crossing the ridges carried snow over existing layers, reshaping the surface continuously. Tracks could disappear within hours. Familiar landmarks could become difficult to recognize. The indigenous Mansi people had traveled these regions for generations and understood the demands of the landscape. Outside that local knowledge, however, the northern Urals often remained a place experienced only by geologists, hunters, and organized winter expeditions. For long periods, the mountains produced very little sound. Wind moved across the slopes. Snow settled into uneven layers. Forests stood still beneath the cold. In such places, the environment often appeared empty. But empty places still carried conditions that had to be understood. In early 1959, a group of experienced hikers from the Ural Polytechnic Institute prepared for a winter expedition across the northern Ural Mountains. Most of them were students or recent graduates. They shared a background shaped by engineering studies, technical training, and a Soviet outdoor culture that placed value on endurance and organized travel. The expedition was led by Igor Dyatlov, a 23-year-old radio engineering student. Those who knew him described him as methodical and capable. He had previous experience with difficult hiking routes and had organized expeditions before. Winter travel in remote regions required planning that went beyond ordinary hiking. Equipment had to be selected carefully. Distances had to be measured realistically. The margin for error narrowed as temperatures dropped. The group consisted of 10 members at the beginning of the journey. Among them were Zinaida Kolmogorova, Rustam Slobodin, Ludmila Dubinina, Alexander Kolevatov, Semyon Zolotaryov, and several others. Their ages ranged mostly from their early 20s to late 30s. This was not an inexperienced group entering unfamiliar terrain without preparation. Many had completed demanding routes before. Several carried the highest hiking certifications available in the Soviet system at the time or were working toward them. Winter expeditions of this type involved long movement across snow-covered terrain while carrying heavy packs through isolated areas. Their destination was a mountain known as Otorten Mountain. The route was intended to qualify as a high-category expedition under Soviet hiking standards. The purpose was not exploration in the traditional sense. Maps already existed. Routes had been recorded before. The journey was designed as a test of skill, endurance, and organization. At the time, there was little reason to expect that it would later become one of the most discussed mountain incidents in modern history. The expedition began in late January of 1959. The group traveled east from Sverdlovsk by train and then continued through smaller settlements that served as the last points of regular activity before the mountains. Winter transport in the region depended on a combination of rail lines, trucks, and local routes. Beyond those points, movement became slower and more dependent on weather and terrain. Photographs taken during the early stages of the trip show ordinary moments. Members of the group stood beside equipment and posed near stations and roads. There was little indication that the journey was different from many other organized winter expeditions taking place in the Soviet Union during that period. Their packs carried food, cameras, notebooks, skis, clothing, and camping equipment designed for extended winter travel. Weight had to be balanced carefully. Every additional item meant more effort over long distances, but every missing item increased risk. The route ahead required self-sufficiency. As the expedition moved farther north, roads gradually disappeared. Forests and snowfields replaced settlements. Human presence became less common. One event during these early days would later stand out in the record. A member of the expedition, Ural Mountains, began experiencing increasing physical discomfort. He suffered from existing health problems that became more difficult under winter conditions. Continuing deeper into the route would have increased the strain. He made the decision to turn back. The remaining 9 members continued forward. At the time, it appeared to be a practical decision made during an ordinary expedition. Later, it would become something else entirely. After Ural Mountains separated from the expedition, the remaining 9 members continued deeper into the northern Ural region. The distance between them and established settlements increased with each day. Winter travel moved according to terrain rather than direct lines on a map. Progress depended on snow depth, visibility, and the amount of energy that could be maintained over long periods. The route toward Otorten required movement through forested areas before gradually rising into more exposed ground. At lower elevations, trees provided some protection from wind. Snow accumulated differently between trunks and ridges. Navigation remained demanding, but recognizable landmarks still existed. Conditions changed as the group moved upward. Open slopes offered fewer points of reference. Wind crossed the terrain without interruption. Snow lifted from the surface and moved across visibility lines, reducing contrast between ground and sky. Under these conditions, even experienced hikers could lose directional accuracy. Records from the expedition later recovered by investigators suggest that the group maintained ordinary routines during these days. They photographed sections of the journey and wrote entries describing weather and movement. There was no documented indication of panic or emergency. On January 31st, the group reached the edge of a forest area and prepared for movement toward higher terrain. Some supplies were cached and left behind for retrieval on the return journey. This was a normal practice. Carrying unnecessary weight over difficult sections reduced efficiency. The following day brought worsening conditions. Snow and wind increased across the upper slopes. Visibility became limited. Evidence later suggested that the group may have drifted west of their intended route while attempting to reach their destination. Small navigational deviations in mountain terrain often carried larger consequences over time. The change may not have appeared serious at first. For experienced hikers, route corrections were common. But winter environments often altered small decisions after they had already been made. As the expedition continued into higher terrain, movement followed a routine familiar to experienced winter hikers. Travel in deep snow required structure. Distances that appeared short on maps could consume many hours of physical effort. Progress depended less on speed and more on consistency. The group traveled using skis designed for cross-country movement. Each member carried a heavy backpack containing clothing, food supplies, shared equipment, and personal items. The weight affected every stage of the day. Climbing required slow and controlled effort. Descending demanded balance across uneven surfaces hidden beneath snow. Daily movement usually began in the morning after camp equipment had been packed and secured. Sleeping areas had to be dismantled. Snow-covered items needed to be cleared and repacked before departure. Small tasks repeated continuously. Moisture inside clothing had to be managed carefully. Wet materials could freeze quickly in low temperatures. Food served a practical purpose. Winter travel required large amounts of energy. Records and recovered supplies later showed ordinary expedition meals for the period: bread, cereals, preserved foods, fats, and other compact items chosen for transport over long distances. Meals were not elaborate. The goal was maintaining calories and routine. Environmental conditions influenced nearly every decision. Wind altered the effort needed to move forward. Deep snow slowed progress. Exposure on open slopes. Increased heat loss. Campsites had to be selected with consideration for terrain and shelter. Forest edges offered protection, while exposed ground increased visibility but left travelers more vulnerable to weather. Photographs recovered later from cameras found with the expedition show moments that remained ordinary. Group members appeared moving through snow, adjusting equipment, or standing during breaks. Some images captured effort, but not distress. The routine itself mattered. Long winter expeditions often depended on repetition. Small systems reduced unnecessary decisions. Tasks became predictable. Equipment had designated locations. Movement followed established patterns. In isolated environments, discipline often replaced comfort. By early February, the group had already spent days moving through cold conditions with increasing exposure. Nothing in the surviving record suggested immediate danger. The journey still appeared to be continuing as planned. During the expedition, the group continued to document their journey through photographs, handwritten notes, and route records. These materials would later become some of the last direct evidence of daily life before contact was lost. Unlike official reports written afterward, these records captured ordinary moments as they happened. The entries that survived described weather conditions, movement across terrain, and routine observations. Some included practical details. Others reflected humor shared among members of the group. Winter expeditions often developed their own temporary culture during long periods of isolation. Repetition created familiarity. Shared effort created structure. The expedition itself operated with organization rather than improvisation. Roles were not rigidly assigned, but experience influenced responsibility. Navigation decisions, camp setup, equipment management, and movement patterns depended on cooperation. Extended winter travel placed pressure on the group as a whole rather than on individuals acting independently. Camps followed a predictable sequence. After movement ended for the day, snow had to be prepared for sleeping areas. Equipment was unloaded and arranged before darkness and cold made tasks more difficult. Clothing and supplies required attention because freezing conditions could gradually affect materials over time. Small problems could expand if left unresolved. Maintaining body temperature was a constant requirement. Even during physical effort, sweat and moisture created additional risk. Layers had to be adjusted according to activity. Too much insulation could lead to overheating during movement. Too little protection increased exposure. Food remained important, but routine itself carried equal value. Repeated actions reduced uncertainty. Familiar schedules divided time into manageable parts. On long expeditions, days often began to resemble one another. Distances, campsites, and weather conditions gradually merged together. Photographs from the later stages of the journey continue to show activity rather than crisis. Members of the group were seen skiing through snow-covered terrain, handling equipment, and moving toward higher elevations. Nothing in the surviving materials indicates that the expedition had entered an emergency situation. The final available images remain restrained and ordinary. They show a group continuing forward into winter conditions that, at the time, still appeared manageable. On February 1, 1959, the expedition moved toward the slopes of Kholat Syakhl. The mountain's name is often translated from the Mansi language as Dead Mountain, although the meaning relates more to a lack of game animals than to danger. At the time, it carried no special significance for the group. Weather conditions had become increasingly difficult. Evidence later examined by investigators suggested that snow and wind had reduced visibility during the day. The group appears to have drifted away from the direct route toward Otorten. Rather than reaching a lower forested area that could provide shelter, they ended the day on an exposed slope. Exactly why this decision was made remains uncertain. Some later interpretations suggested that the group intended to maintain altitude and avoid losing progress. Others proposed that worsening visibility may have made movement into lower terrain difficult. Historical records do not provide a definitive answer. What is known comes from physical evidence found afterward. The group established camp on the eastern slope of Kholat Syakhl. The tent was positioned on an incline and partially cut into the snowpack to create a level surface. Building camps on snow-covered slopes was not unusual. Experienced winter travelers often shaped terrain to create stable sleeping areas. Recovered materials indicate that routine activities continued. Boots were removed inside the tent. Clothing and personal items were arranged. Journals and cameras remained with the group. Food supplies and equipment were present. There were no signs suggesting preparation for rapid movement away from the campsite. The final photographs recovered from camera film show members of the expedition during camp preparations. The images are incomplete and sometimes blurred by weather and movement. They capture ordinary tasks rather than unusual events. Sometime during the night, circumstances changed. Exactly what happened inside or around the camp has never been established with complete certainty. Investigators later discovered that the tent had been cut open from the inside. Personal belongings remained inside. Footprints led away from the campsite and down the slope. No surviving witness accounts exist from that night. Only physical evidence remained. The final known moments of the expedition ended there, on an exposed section of mountain where wind moved freely across the snow. After that point, the record becomes dependent on what others would later find. The expedition had been expected to send a telegram after completing its route. Delays on winter journeys were not unusual, and at first there was little concern. Travel schedules often shifted because of weather conditions and terrain. Extra days were commonly accepted as part of long expeditions. As time passed, however, concern began to increase. Family members and officials from the institute began requesting information. When communication still did not arrive, search efforts were organized. Fellow students, volunteers, local personnel, and later military resources joined the operation. Search teams moved toward the last known section of the route. Winter conditions complicated the process. Snow had altered sections of the terrain and reduced visibility across open areas. Aircraft participated in the search, while ground teams moved through forests and slopes below the mountain region. On February 26, searchers located the tent on the slope of Kholat Syakhl. The scene appeared unusual. The tent remained partially standing beneath snow accumulation. Equipment and supplies were still inside. Investigators later documented clothing, boots, food, and personal belongings left behind. Evidence suggested that members of the expedition had departed without taking many items normally considered necessary for winter survival. The tent itself drew immediate attention. Investigators recorded cuts made through the fabric from the interior side. The exact sequence of events surrounding those cuts remains uncertain, but documentation indicated that openings had been created from inside the shelter. Tracks in the snow were also reported. Investigators observed a series of footprints leading downhill from the campsite toward lower terrain and a nearby forest area. Reports later described some tracks as appearing orderly rather than showing signs of uncontrolled movement, although weather conditions had already affected parts of the evidence. The footprints gradually became more difficult to follow. Near the edge of the forest, searchers found signs of a fire beneath a cedar tree. Broken branches nearby suggested that individuals had climbed or attempted to climb the tree. Further discoveries followed. Bodies were found at different locations between the forest and the campsite. Others would remain hidden beneath snow until later stages of the search. The mountain itself provided no explanation. It only preserved fragments. In the days and weeks that followed, recovery efforts continued across the mountain and forest areas below the campsite. Winter conditions had already altered much of the terrain. Snow accumulation covered sections of evidence, while wind continued to reshape exposed surfaces. Search teams worked in an environment that changed even as they examined it. The first bodies recovered were found near the cedar tree where signs of a fire had been discovered. Later examinations reported varying levels of clothing and exposure among the group members. Additional individuals were found between the tree and the campsite itself, positioned along a path that suggested movement back toward the tent. Months later, after snow and ice began to recede, the remaining members of the expedition were located in a ravine beneath deep snow accumulation. Medical examinations documented different causes and conditions among the group. Several individuals showed evidence consistent with exposure to extreme cold. Others had significant physical injuries. Later discussions and interpretations would focus heavily on these findings. Over time, theories began to multiply. Some proposed hidden military activity. Others suggested unknown natural events or unusual external causes. Public discussion often moved beyond available evidence. The historical record remained narrower. Investigators documented locations, injuries, weather conditions, recovered materials, and physical evidence. Beyond those findings, certainty became difficult to establish. The mountain did not preserve explanations. It preserved only outcomes. The expedition had entered the northern Urals as an organized group with equipment, experience, and preparation. Weeks later, search teams moved through the same landscape trying to reconstruct events from traces left behind in snow. Some questions remained unanswered. Many still do. The official Soviet investigation continued through the months following the discovery of the expedition members. Investigators gathered photographs, medical examinations, witness statements, weather information, and observations from the search effort. Their objective was to establish a sequence of events using the evidence that remained. The process faced limitations from the beginning. No direct witnesses existed. The incident had taken place in an isolated environment where weather continuously altered the landscape. Snow, wind, and time had affected physical traces before investigators reached the site. In May of 1959, the investigation reached its formal conclusion. The final statement reported that the members of the expedition had died because of what was described as a compelling natural force. The wording was broad and did not identify a specific event or mechanism. No detailed explanation accompanied the phrase. The case was eventually closed. For many years, access to portions of the investigative material remained limited. This lack of clarity created space for speculation. Discussions expanded far beyond the available evidence and sometimes moved into claims unsupported by historical records. Decades later, renewed examination of the incident led researchers and investigators to revisit the known facts. Several modern studies focused on environmental explanations. Snow movement, terrain conditions, and avalanche-related processes became subjects of renewed analysis. Some later investigations concluded that a form of snow slab movement or pressure event may have contributed to the group's decision to leave the tent. Not all researchers reached identical conclusions. Some details remained debated because evidence was incomplete from the beginning. What remained consistent across official records was simpler. 9 experienced hikers entered the northern Ural Mountains in winter conditions. They established a camp on an exposed slope. During the night, they left that shelter and did not return. The certainty of those events ended there. The incident in the northern Ural Mountains gradually moved beyond the boundaries of a single expedition. Over time it became part of a larger discussion about risk, uncertainty, and the limits of human understanding in remote environments. Many survival stories eventually settle into a clear structure. A mistake is identified. A chain of events becomes visible. A lesson emerges with certainty. This one remained different. The people involved were not unprepared travelers entering unfamiliar conditions without experience. They understood winter movement, route planning, and the demands of isolated terrain. They carried equipment intended for long travel and had previously completed difficult expeditions. Yet remote environments do not always operate according to preparation alone. Mountains can appear stable while conditions change beyond immediate observation. Small shifts in weather, snow structure, or visibility can alter decisions without announcing themselves. By the time consequences become visible, the conditions that created them may already have disappeared. The northern Urals continued as they always had. Snow returned each winter. Wind crossed the ridges and open slopes. Routes used by hikers and researchers remained in place. People continued to move through the region. The mountain itself kept no record of theories or debates. It kept only traces of a journey that ended there. In 1959, 9 people entered those mountains with a planned route and an expected return date. The route was documented. The return never was.